So now we're going to talk about how to assess risk of bias for systematic review. And we're specifically going to use AMSTAR2 as our example. Now, you guys will have been familiar with assessing risk of bias in primary studies, and this is similar, although there are some key differences. Now, it's important to understand that a lot of people think, systematic reviews, they pull it all together. They're, basically sort of the gold standard, the best evidence. Well, the problem is not all systematic reviews and meta-analyses are created equal. And just as primary studies can have characteristics that limit their validity and so call into question their findings, the same is true of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. We basically have to know, can we trust what they're telling us? So, what are some critical elements that can limit confidence in the confidence that we have in systematic reviews? Now, there are a couple of writing guides, AMSTAR2 and Prisma. These are basically guides that tell systematic review creators what critical elements are important to have in the systematic review. Now, what's nice is AMSTAR2 is designed both for evaluating systematic reviews as well as a checklist for authors who are writing systematic reviews. So it's kind of a dual-purpose tool. Now, here are the AMSTAR2 criteria. You'll notice some of these I've put out in red. These are critical flaws. That is to say, if you get something wrong here, it can really decrease the confidence that we have in their findings. So, again, not all of the domains are equally weighted. And I want you to notice something. These items are considered particularly important by the AMSTAR authors. And again, these are the sources of critical flaws. Now, I want to point out that 2 of these criteria deal with risk of bias assessment. So we'll really want to pay attention to how the different articles assess, or the different systematic reviews assess the risk of bias of the component articles. Now, the differentiating between critical and non-critical weaknesses is key because this plays into the assessment of the overall level of confidence we can have. So, for instance, just having a single critical flaw can flip a study from being high or moderate to low. So just one of these critical errors can mean we have low confidence in the findings of that systematic review. So now we're going to do a little practice, and I'm going to show you guys, we're going to walk through the AMSTAR and talk about some of the criteria. Now, we're going to walk through the checklist, but one thing that is very important that I want to point out is that the AMSTAR2, like most all risk of bias tools, comes with a companion document that tells you how to basically understand all these different pieces. And so I highly encourage you to have that document available when you are walking through. But let's just look right now at these tools. And what I'm going to do is show you, the questions. I think some of the questions are probably a little tricky, and then compare some different systematic reviews that we'll be looking at. So the first, did the research question inclusion criteria for the review include the components of the PICO? How you answer this is you would just basically check off, did they describe the population, the intervention, or in our case, an exposure, a comparator group if that's relevant, and it isn't always, because sometimes when you're looking at, the effects of pollution, there is no, necessarily if you're looking at a population study of the effects of pollution, there's not a real clear comparison group. Everybody's exposed. So this one's less critical, so don't worry too much about that, but they should have at least the population, the intervention or exposure, and the outcome. Sometimes they give the time frame, and that's you can check that too. Now, again, the AMSTAR uses the kind of yes-no or partial yes-no approach. I prefer probably yes, probably no kind of approach, but that's the way we work it. And so what you would do is you would just check these and then make a decision. And again, I think the most critical ones are population, intervention, exposure, and outcome. So if they tell you that, it doesn't have to be set out as a formal PICO question, but they should tell you of those three components. Now let's look at, did the review contain an explicit statement of the review methods? Okay, this is a protocol. Now, what's important to note here is this is a critical flaw. If they didn't say that they had a plan beforehand, then the problem is that could flip the whole thing, no matter how good it is. So let's look at these. So what they should have, the author should indicate, is that they had, for a partial yes, all of these should be in place. They had the review question, search strategy, inclusion, risk of bias assessment. In addition to these, for a full yes, they had to have the meta-analysis synthesis plan, the plan for investigating heterogeneity, etc. And it should be, and this is important, registered. So let's look at a couple of examples. First, I'm going to look at this one here, and what we'll see is they actually, right here, had a registered protocol. They even give you the link to it, so I can click to go through to Prospero, and I can see, did they meet all of these criteria? And in this case, if you've never registered a protocol with Prospero, you would have to specify all those components. So if it's registered, you can pretty much just say yes to all of these things. So that would be a full-on yes. But let's look at something that's maybe a little less clear. Okay, so this is a Pache, and what I'm going to point out is that you'll notice that under the methods, the very first thing they start with is a protocol. And so what they tell you is that this was undertaken and reported in accordance with PRISMA, which would lead us to believe, and also MOOSE, which is for meta-analyses, which would lead us to believe that they had actually planned this out ahead of time, knowing what all the criteria from the PRISMA and the MOOSE would be, but they don't actually tell us explicitly that they did all these things. And so they didn't file an IRB, which makes sense because you wouldn't typically do that. So this one's a little fuzzier. We could go back to the list. Well, if they're following PRISMA, they would have had to specify a review question, a search strategy, inclusion, exclusion criteria. It doesn't look like they registered it, so we don't have this. So for this one, it's a little fuzzy, but again, just knowing what they would have need to do if they're following these two writing guides, I would say it's probably a partial yes. Now let's look at the blank. What we see here is in methods, they never mention protocol. They just jump right in with their search criteria. Then they go on and they talk about how they extracted and the data and how they generated their outcome measures. But there's not even a hint of any kind of pre-existing plan or protocol. So for the blank, that one, for me, I would go a no. So again, we have a yes, where they registered the protocol in Prospero, a partial yes with the Pache, because at least they're following some writing guidelines that we know have those criteria, and then the blank, who doesn't mention it at all. All right? Now, the next question, did the review authors explain their selection of study designs? Again, for ours, it's always going to be probably non-randomized studies, so NRSIs, they're studies of interventions. We're not actually studying interventions, but we could say non-randomized studies of exposures. Why did they choose these? This one is not a critical one, and the explanation is probably found in the introduction. This is why we're looking at this. Again, this one's pretty straightforward. Did they have a comprehensive literature strategy? Now, this is important because they need to specify what databases they search, Medline, Embase, Cochrane, etc. And they have to have at least two databases that were searched. And again, we can look back, even in the Blanc, they say, look, we looked at PubMed and Embase. Well, that meets the bare minimum. The Pache and the this other, they, were much more comprehensive in terms of what they pulled on. Did they provide a keyword and or search strategy? Sometimes authors will provide a full detailed syntax, usually in an appendix. Other times they'll just say, we use these keywords. That's probably okay. They don't have to sort of put the whole syntax in. But as long as they give us some sense of the keywords that they use and justified any publication restrictions. For instance, we limited to English. Well, because all of the authors were only English speakers, or during certain periods, during certain years. And then, again, for a full yes, they would have had to have specified all these other things, that they searched the bibliographies of the included studies, trial registries. Now, this is not going to be relevant for epidemiological studies. There are no trial registries for epidemiological studies, so you can pretty much ignore this one. Included or consulted content experts. Again, that you want them to sort of specify what they did here. Again, for a partial yes, you only have to have these three. For a full yes, all of these. Did they perform study selection in duplicate? What they should tell you is that from the results that at least 2 of the team members did the screening for the title and abstract and full text. Okay, so again, at least 2 reviewers did it, or 2 reviewers did a sample and achieved good agreement. Sometimes, if it's a very large, say there are 1,000 articles, the authors may, screen 100 together, and if they agree on at least 80% of the time, then they kind of go off and do the rest on their own, and that's perfectly fine as well. They should describe this. If they don't mention that, don't give you any indication of how the screening was done, that's probably going to be a no. Then, here we go. The authors perform data extraction in duplicate. Again, this is important. They should describe to you that, at least 2 members, they were screened in duplicate, or, again, you can have screeners who, do a sample where they double screen, achieve at least 80% agreement. Okay, they should explain all that. Another way to do this, and this is done quite commonly, is you'll have one reviewer will extract data, and another one will then follow along behind and confirm. That's not explicitly listed here, but I think that one also works. So if they say it was extracted and then we had a quality assurance sort of pass where a different author reviewed their responses, that'll work as a yes. Did they provide a list of excluded studies with justifications? Let me show you what this means. Now, you will see almost always, and it really should, a Prisma flowchart like this, and this just tells how many articles they started with, removing the duplicates, et cetera, and you get down to the end. What that question is getting at is, at the full text, they should have the number of studies that were excluded and then the reason why. So, for instance, they dropped out 4 studies here that only dealt with general lung diseases, or they only reported incidence or prevalence of IPF. So they dropped 2 of those. Again, they should provide these. Now, it can be a little confusing because when you say provided a list of all potentially relevant studies, does that mean that they have to give you the citations? No, they don't. Sometimes they will, but that's actually pretty rare. And if they do give a list of here are all the the articles that we read. So if we jump back to the Pache, we read these 29 articles. We selected 16, so there's 13 we excluded, and they would give you the citations of those 13, usually in appendix if they do it. But that, like I said, is incredibly unusual. Really what you want to see is that they tell you how many they excluded and they give you the reasons. And so I would say for the Pache, that's a yes. Let's look at the Blanc. The Blanc is interesting because they don't give you any Prisma flowchart, nothing, okay? So we don't know what they looked at. We don't know how many they excluded, all right? So again, for the Blanc, straight up no. We just don't have any information at all. Did they describe the included studies in detail? And they give you what they should tell you about the population, intervention, comparators. Again, comparators isn't always relevant. You have to make that determination. In a lot of the systematic reviews we'll be looking at, you'll have cases and controls. The controls are going to be the comparators, okay, and then the research designs. What does this look like? Let me show you in the Pache. Usually in tables like this, you will have, and I'm not going to bother turning it sideways, but you'll see they're just giving a lot of detail for each study. Who did they, what was the design, how many people, what was the population, et cetera, et cetera. So they're just providing a lot of information. Again, for the Blanc, they do somewhat less. They do give you study type, incident cases, not really a ton on the population unless you're just counting the country as the population, which may be fine in this case. All right. So again, you just walk down through, and did they, describe each of these? Did they describe the population in detail? Again, you'll probably have to look at methods for this to see, does this satisfy, did they, is it just everybody in Sweden? Is it occupation or people that worked in certain occupations in Sweden, etc.? Again, there's no hard and fast on this. Just use your best judgment. Then, did they use a satisfactory technique for assessing risk of bias? This is a critical issue. Now, again, they won't have included RCTs because in the stuff that we're studying with exposures, you can't randomize people to breathing bad air. So we're talking non-randomized studies. All right, what should they look at? Confounding selection bias. They should use a tool that uses these two. For a full yes, they also have to tell you that they assessed these things as well. The methods used to ascertain. How did they measure exposures and outcomes? Okay, etc. Now, let's look at Pache and see what we've got here. There's interesting because they don't tell you all of the criteria that they use. What they do tell you is that they use the Newcastle Ottawa Quality Assessment Scale, which is appropriate for the types of designs that they're looking at. I know what the Newcastle Ottawa includes, and so I know that it does include confounding, selection, okay, how the outcomes and exposures were ascertained. So knowing about that tool, I can say yes. If you didn't know what the Newcastle Ottawa was, you would want to pull that up and then be able to compare what kind of criteria they used to assess risk of bias relative to the criteria that they have here. Now, I should say that if they tell you that they used any of the Cochrane tools, like the Robbins I or the Robbins E, you don't even have to look any further. Any of the Cochrane tools meet these criteria. So those would just be a straight up yes for those. Here's an interesting one. Let's go back over here, and I want to show you something that is a little sneaky. In this article, they talk about the data extraction and quality assessment. So you're set up to think, oh, okay, they're going to tell me about which risk of bias tool. If you read this, you find out that they never mention risk of bias at all. So it's like, well, okay, what tool did they use? They also never present risk of bias information anywhere in the article. So even though it's in a header, it's never mentioned. Okay, so for this one, again, this would end up being a no, and this is a critical flaw. Did they report the sources of funding for the studies? This isn't a critical flaw. Very often this will not be done, and it's not always really that important. It's probably most important. The funding is going to be most important for clinical trials because of industry funding, white hat bias, things that we know, tend to bias or lead to biased results. For epidemiological studies, this one is really not very important. So even if this is a no, you probably don't need to sort of downgrade the overall. Now, if there was a meta-analysis performed, okay, so again, we're going to be focused on the non-randomized studies, okay, did they use an appropriate weighted technique? Now, this can be a little confusing if you've never done a meta-analysis, but basically, you would expect them to use a random effects model. If they do that and did inverse variance weighting, if they did that, then it's going to be a yes. They combined effects that were adjusted for confounding. And this is important because one of the things that we see in the Pache is that they will report findings separately for, say, if they were smoking. So you'll see in this case, they reported the overall findings, just the raw, findings. But then what they did is they limited to high-quality studies. That's a way of adjusting for confounding. They also do it for smoking. In the Blanc, none of that is done. They just give you raw values and don't give you any more information. So for the Blanc, this wouldn't be true. This one isn't going to be relevant because they don't. Our studies do not include randomized controlled trials, so you can just ignore this one. Then on 12, again, more questions about the meta-analysis. Did the authors assess the potential risk of bias? What they should have done is a sub-analysis where they look, say, like what you saw in the Pache, at only the low-risk studies, the high-quality studies, or they actually did a subgroup analysis based on risk of bias. Okay, so if they did either one of those things, then it's a yes there. Did the reviewers account for risk of bias when interpreting and discussing the results? Again, what we saw in the Pache is they give the results separately based on risk of bias. Okay, so that is actually a yes. Okay, so but other ones that don't even say, even if they did do a risk of bias, if they don't give you separate results based on that, that's a flaw. Did the authors provide a satisfactory explanation for any heterogeneity? Heterogeneity is this, and I'll make this bigger. Actually, I'm going to zoom in here. Okay, a little too far there. Okay, so let's go down here. You see this I-square value right here. So we see that is the between study heterogeneity. And that just gets at studies were done on different populations, carried out in different ways, executed using different procedures, etc. And that is that is the heterogeneity, or the I-squared measure. Now what they should do is they should, according to the AMSTAR, provide some explanation of why that heterogeneity occurred. Very often it's narrative, where they say, these studies, that happened in this country, there tends to be that has primarily urban areas, etc. So, basically just trying, what was it about the studies that was different that would lead to the level of heterogeneity? The better way of doing that is explaining heterogeneity by using subgroup analyses. And you see that a bit in the Pache, where they are looking at not just overall exposures, but breaking it down by different categories of types of exposure. Even within those, there's going to be some heterogeneity, sometimes, not always, because if we look here for mechanical, for people who work in the mechanical industry, we see zero heterogeneity. There's nothing to explain. But on the whole, again, they should sort of explain that. If they did a quantitative synthesis, again, did they do a publication bias analysis, or what's also called small study bias? They should tell you explicitly, they did a check for publication bias. They'll very often provide a funnel plot, and then they'll discuss that. If they don't mention that at all, then that's going to be a no. If there's no meta-analysis, then obviously that's not going to be relevant. Did the critical appraisal tool or did the authors review any potential sources of conflict of interest? Okay. That is to say, the funding that they received, did they report? And it's pretty standard nowadays for, at the end of an article, authors will report, let me scoot back out and see if they do that here, will report conflicts of interest. So we scroll way down, and acknowledgments, disclosure statements. What you're looking for is a disclosure and funding. Do they report this? If they did, great. That's all you need. So once you've gone through all of these, then the very last question, and I don't have it in the tool, but we have it in the extraction template, is to make a judgment of overall risk based on the presence or absence of the flaws that you found in the by using the tool. Again, there's not a right and wrong absolute on any of these. These are based on your judgments from having closely read the article and then walked through the checklist. If you get confused or you want some help, definitely reach out to the lead analysts for help. But it should be, again, don't overthink it. It should be relatively straightforward. And so with that, again, that's how we would use the AMSTAR2 tool to appraise the risk of bias in systematic reviews.